Our first speaker, this is the first time he's ever come to and spoken at an Alberta Prosperity Project event. He is an independent researcher and writer. He is a columnist for the Western Standard. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Master of Arts degree in political science from the University of Calgary, and obtained his political science PhD from the University of Alberta. He has written more than 2 books, but 2 books that I'm going to mention: Alberta, Separatism Then and Now, which accounts how federal government policies have been designed to exploit the West, Alberta in particular. The second book is called No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. He and his wife Ivy have 11 children and have been homeschooling for over 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Wagner.
Hello, is this working? Good. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. I just want to start by saying I was very glad that this meeting was started with a prayer. I think that's the way these kind of things should be, and I was really pleased that they started with a prayer. So I'm going to be talking about the history of the Alberta independence movement, and it's important to understand the movement from a historical perspective, because it's not something that's just arisen recently. It's not just the last couple of years or 3 years or so with Justin Trudeau that have caused many Albertans to consider independence as an option. This goes back many years, and we need to understand it from that historical perspective. In fact, the American Declaration of Independence used the term a long train of abuses. The reason the colonies needed to separate from Britain because there had been a long train of abuses that the colonies had suffered from Britain. And I believe that Alberta has also suffered a long train of abuses, and that helps to justify why we should become independent ourselves. So the West has felt unhappy within Canada right from the very beginning. Like when you think back, this part of the world, the prairies, used to be part of what was called Rupert's Land, which was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company. So this area became part of Canada as a matter of a purchase without consulting the people that lived here. Like there were people that lived here, and in particular there was the Red River Colony, where there were thousands of people. And they were purchased by Canada and added to Canada without being consulted. And that contributed to the first Riel Rebellion in 1870, because they had not been consulted. They were just suddenly attached to Canada. And some of those people had other ideas about what they wanted to do. Now, once this became part of Canada, of course, the settlers were brought in to create an agricultural economy on the prairies. And the farmers had a couple of different struggles because of being part of Canada. For one thing, there was a protective tariff, so that the farmers had to buy their equipment from Eastern Canada. They couldn't buy from the United States. So they had to buy their equipment from Eastern Canada. They had to pay higher prices for their farm equipment that they needed. And when they sold their grain, they had to sell them through middlemen who would take some of the price for themselves, and they had to pay the cost of transportation to the market. So the farmers were paying more for the equipment and getting less for their grain when they were selling them. So the farmers were not happy about that, of course, and they didn't just sit back and take it. Actually, there's a very famous cartoon from 1915, and it'll be too small for you to see from here, but many of you have seen this. A cow standing across Canada, and the cow is being fed by the prairie farmers, and the milk is being taken by the Eastern businessmen. But that's over 100 years ago, right? And it still represents in some respects how things are today. So the farmers didn't just sit back and do nothing. I mean, they organized politically. You might remember the United Farmers of Alberta as a political party. There was farmers' parties. There was a federal party in the early 1920s called the Progressive Party. The farmers fought back, and they did get some concessions. But then one of the real biggest reactions where the farmers fought back was during the Depression. Alberta elected the Social Credit Party, to be the social credit government in Alberta. That was a very unique thing that Alberta did, and it was international news. People heard about that around the world. Alberta did something different. Alberta reacted to the Depression differently from many other places. And Ted Byfield, who was the founder of Alberta Report magazine, he wrote this about Alberta electing the social credit government. He said, "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." So Albertans did fight back against many of these problems that they suffered from Eastern Canada, but they never sought for independence. It was always fighting back and wanting to remain within Canada. But that changed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. Pierre Trudeau changed everything. With Pierre Trudeau, a threshold was crossed where Albertans weren't just upset with Canada anymore. Now many of them began to consider the need for independence. And one of the first things that Trudeau did when he became Prime Minister was to enact the Official Languages Act, which many Westerners saw as shoving French down their throats. But the real problems with Trudeau began in 1973 with the energy crisis. There was a war in the Middle East. The price of oil went from approximately $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in a very short period of time, and the money really started pouring into Alberta. But Trudeau didn't like the idea that Alberta was benefiting from its resources, which it owned. So he did a couple of different things to make sure that we wouldn't benefit. For one thing, he established that the price of oil in Canada would be much lower than the world price. So Alberta oil was being sold to Eastern Canada at much less than the world price. So Alberta was losing out at that end. And also Alberta exported oil to the United States at the world price. But Trudeau instituted an export tax on oil so that the federal government would get a bunch of that money when Alberta oil was exported to the United States. So in both of these ways, Alberta lost out on the revenue that it should have received from its oil. And another thing to keep in mind is that oil is a non-renewable resource. Once it's gone, and we don't get it back. And Premier Peter Lougheed was very concerned about that at the time, that if the money of our non-renewable resources are lost, we'll never have that for building Alberta for the future. And of course, that money was lost. But Peter Lougheed put up a very strong fight against Trudeau during the 1970s. And it was during that period when Albertans first began to organize, like this independence groups began to organize for the first time during the 1970s because of this conflict with Pierre Trudeau. There had never been organizations of that kind in Alberta before. There was a federal election in 1979, and Joe Clark was elected briefly in a minority government. So he was expected to be more favorable towards Alberta because he was from Alberta and he was a progressive conservative. But his government only lasted a few months. It fell, and so there was another election in February of 1980. Now, there's something very distinctive about this 1980 federal election. The Liberal Party campaigned directly against Alberta. Like Trudeau was running again, Pierre Trudeau was running for Prime Minister, and he was basically telling Central Canadians that he would put Alberta in its place if he could get reelected. And one of the Liberal campaign officials at the time later said that basically the unofficial motto of that Liberal campaign was, "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." And this is very different from the way things had been done before, because Canada is a very large country, and in any large country there's always conflicts between different regions. That's just kind of a natural thing. And normally national leaders would try and smooth over those differences to protect national unity. But here was a campaign where the Prime Minister or who would become Prime Minister, the man who would become Prime Minister, was campaigning against one particular region of the country. He was exploiting the divisions. Rather than trying to smooth over the divisions, he was exploiting regional divisions to become Prime Minister again, and he actually won, as you know. Now, of course, Albertans became very upset when Pierre Trudeau won re-election, and it wasn't long after that he introduced the National Energy Program, which everybody remembers, because it did so much damage to the Alberta economy. The federal government, through the National Energy Program, was essentially trying to take over Alberta's energy industry so it could direct it and benefit from it, rather than Alberta directing it. But the National Energy Program is quite legendary in Alberta. Now, one of the things that's quite distinctive too about the National Energy Program and Pierre Trudeau in 1980, when you look at polling about support for independence in Alberta, before 1980, almost every poll that was done on support for independence in Alberta was like single-digit support, 4%, 5%, that kind of thing, before 1980. Since 1980, the polling that's been done, it's always double-digit support. So something happened. Trudeau did something that changed Alberta permanently, from very little support for independence to much more support for independence. So I refer to Pierre Trudeau as the father of the Alberta independence movement. It never would have started without him. Of course, because of the support for independence at that time, there was a party called the Western Canada Concept, and they ran a candidate in a by-election in the Old Didsbury constituency in 1982, and he won. That's a constituency just south of here, if I'm correct. So Gordon Kessler became the MLA for Olds Didsbury as for running for the Western Canada Concept, and it was the first time that a Western separatist was elected in Western Canada, since, unless you count the Real Rebellion, it was the first time ever, but the Real Rebellion was kind of a separatist movement of its own, I guess. So Pierre Trudeau resigned in 1984 and he was replaced by John Turner. And then in the federal election of September that year, Brian Mulroney won for the Conservatives. Now this was seen as something that would be very good for Alberta. Alberta had been supporting the federal Conservative Party for many years, and every MP from Alberta in the 1984 election was with the Conservatives and part of Brian Mulroney's caucus. So we figured that, many people in Alberta and Western Canada figured that now was our time, now we were in. But what we didn't count on, though, is that Brian Mulroney and the Conservative Party, as all major political parties in Canada, they have to cater to central Canada. They have to cater to Ontario and Quebec. So, in 1986, there was a competition for a maintenance contract for Canada's CF-18 fighter planes. There was a company in Winnipeg and a company in Montreal. There was a competition as to which company would be best for that contract. Winnipeg won the contract, and the Mulroney government awarded that contract to Montreal. So even though he had the Alberta MPs and there was lots of Western influence, he still, even as a Conservative Party Prime Minister, still wanted to cater to the Eastern Canada, to Central Canada, and he gave that contract to Montreal. Now that led to a very big upsurge, and again in support for Western independence, but it did something else as well. It got Preston Manning involved. Preston Manning, of course, at that time created a new movement called the Reform Party. Preston had seen that there was support for independence, and he thought he could funnel that support into a movement that would actually enhance the West's position within Canada rather than having the West having to leave Canada. So the independence movement kind of folded into the Reform Party, and there was one of the leaders of the Western Canada Concept, his name was Jack Ramsey. He ended up joining the Reform Party and became a member of Parliament for the Reform Party. So the Reform Party basically became, the party that represented Western interests in Canada. And one of the goals, of course, of the Reform Party was the Triple E Senate, a Senate that would be elected by the people, effective, and have equal representation from each province. Many of you have probably heard of that. So that was the goal. And the Reform Party, of course, elected many members of Parliament from Western Canada, in 1993 and 1997, and became the official opposition in 1997. But as time went on, the Reform Party became more and more focused on being a national party and not so much just a Western party. So it eventually became the Canadian Alliance in 2000. And then the Canadian Alliance merged with the Progressive Conservative Party in 2003 to form the Conservative Party of Canada. So it wasn't so much focused on the West anymore, although the first leader of the Conservative Party was Stephen Harper. And Stephen Harper, of course, had been one of the major organizers for the Reform Party. And because he was a Westerner, a genuine Westerner, many Albertans were not concerned then while he was Prime Minister. They weren't concerned about the East-West issues so much because we knew we had a man in Ottawa who was going to defend our interests. Of course, in 2015, Stephen Harper lost the election to Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau immediately began to implement his climate change policies that were very harmful for Alberta. One of those policies was the Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which was going to make pipeline projects much more harder to get approved. And so it was called the No More Pipelines Bill, so that Alberta would not be able to build pipelines to ship its oil out. Another bill he brought in was Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which many people call the Alberta Tanker Ban, which prevented Alberta oil from being exported off the west coast of BC. So both of these policies, of course, are designed to prevent the export of Alberta oil. Now, one of the things they did then was they indirectly circumvent the Constitution, because Section 92A of Canada's Constitution gives the provinces ownership and control of the development of resources. But if you can't ship those resources anywhere, you really don't have control. So those two bills, as well as the carbon tax and other climate change policies, basically indirectly undermine the Constitution by preventing Alberta from exercising proper control over its resources. They do indirectly what the Constitution would not allow them to do. Of course, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario challenged the carbon tax at the Supreme Court level, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Trudeau's tax. There were three Supreme Court justices that ruled for the provinces, but it was a 6-3 decision against the provinces in favor of Trudeau. But one of those justices pointed out in his decision, in his minority opinion, that basically the carbon tax was a threat to the provinces because it was allowing the federal government to do indirectly what it couldn't do directly. And in this way, it wasn't just a threat in terms of the carbon tax. It actually had implications for other policies where the federal government could interfere on provincial jurisdiction in other areas because of the precedent set by the carbon tax. So even though they're trying to shut down the development and export of Alberta oil, nevertheless, as you know, the federal government still wants the money from Alberta's oil. And there's a professor at the University of Calgary, Robert Manzel, and he's been studying this issue for decades, and he was the one who calculated that since from 1965 until 2018, Alberta has made a net contribution of $630 billion, to central Canada or to the federal government. So that's $630 billion, that Alberta will never have back, that was taken from our non-renewable resources. Now imagine what would happen if we had that money, for developing our economy here. So they want our money, but they want to shut down our economy. It's almost like they're trying to push us out of Confederation. It seems to me that there's no organization in Canada's history that has done more to push Alberta out of Canada than the Liberal Party of Canada. Right from the time of Pierre Trudeau, it's like they've been trying to get us out. Like we have organizations in Alberta that from time to time, campaign for independence, but they come and go. But one organization has been consistent in trying to get us out, and that's the Liberal Party of Canada. Of course, Trudeau won re-election in 2019, and that led to more of an upsurge in support for independence, and that's what we're seeing right now. So that's so far, that's the bad news. Now, there is some good news. The good news is that Canada's constitutional law allows provinces to secede from Confederation. As you remember, there was a Quebec separatist movement for many years, and there probably still is, but they held a referendum on independence in 1980, which was soundly defeated. Then they held another referendum in 1995 that was only barely defeated. And after that, the federal government made a reference case to the Supreme Court. That is, they asked the Supreme Court its opinion on Quebec independence. Could Quebec unilaterally declare independence from Canada? Now, the Supreme Court said no, Quebec could not unilaterally declare independence from Canada, but it could if it held a referendum with a clear question on independence and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then the Canadian government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence. So this is a Supreme Court decision which creates constitutional law that will allow any province to have a referendum, hold a referendum, and if there's a clear majority of people voting in favor of a clearly worded question in favor of independence, then that means that the federal government must negotiate the independence of that province. So there is this constitutional law that gives us a way out. Now, this isn't the same in every country. There's other countries where this is illegal. You may remember just a few years ago, the Catalonia region of Spain had a referendum on independence, and the leaders of the referendum were jailed, arrested. And I had someone say to me, well, see, that's what's going to happen to Alberta. If we have a referendum, the leaders will be jailed, we won't be allowed out. But this is a completely different situation because Spain's constitution forbids any region from leaving. That their constitution forbids that. Canada's constitution does not forbid that. In fact, there's a constitutional law, a way for us to get out legally. So those are not to be compared with, Alberta's situation is much clearer and much freer than some of these other countries. Of course, based on that secession reference case I've been discussing, Parliament passed what's called the Clarity Act, which supposedly sets out the details of how this could be achieved. But there are a number of scholars who think the Clarity Act is too stringent, that it's more stringent than what the secession reference case allows for. But the bottom line in all that, there could be debates about what's best and whether the Clarity Act is really that good or not. But the bottom line comes to this. If a large majority of Albertans clearly wants independence, we can get out. That's the bottom line. There's all kinds of different, debates on different aspects of law. But if a large majority of Albertans want out, we can become independent. Just one final point I'd like to make, and that is, the desire for independence should be seen as political self-defense. We are just defending ourselves against an attack. This did not originally rise from anything that people did in Alberta. We've been happy in Canada to one degree or another, for all these generations. And we were just, minding our own business when Trudeau attacked us, in the 1970s, and when Justin Trudeau's attacking us now. We did not initiate this. This didn't come from here. We're just defending ourselves. We should see this as we are defending ourselves against an attack. And so that's why we need to become independent. It's the only way we can defend ourselves from federal government. Something like Senate reform is not going to work. We've tried that before. And I tell people, if Preston Manning and the Reform Party, with all they did, if they could not get Senate reform, then nobody can get Senate reform. All these different reforms would make things better for Alberta. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party couldn't do it, it can't be done. We won't get a movement as big as that or a leader as good as that anymore. So, and we shouldn't even look to the Conservative Party necessarily. I mean, having a Conservative government is better than having a Liberal government. There's no question about that. But ultimately, the Canadian system it requires a party to win in Central Canada. It cannot achieve parity unless A party cannot achieve power unless it wins in central Canada. Even the Conservative parties, even if Pierre Poilievre becomes the leader, he's good in many respects, but he still has to win central Canada. So the incentive is always to cater to central Canada. Now look at the people who are trying to shut down our energy resources. When you think of Justin Trudeau was elected in Montreal. Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Climate Change, was elected in Montreal. Chrystia Freeland, the Finance Minister, she's elected in Toronto. I mean, she's from here originally, but she represents Toronto. These people were elected by others by 3,000 kilometers away. Like the people that are shutting down our economy were elected by people 3,000 kilometers away. Now, if we were electing people here, for the benefit of Albertans, we would have a completely different economic policy, a completely different policy on energy development. The only way we can get elect leaders who are going to do what's best for Alberta is for Alberta to become independent. And then we can elect leaders for their benefit for Alberta. So Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about and become independent. Now, just to finish off quickly, I've brought a couple of books along. This is my most recent book, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. This is an argument as to why Alberta should become independent. And actually, the foreword is by Vince Byfield. That's Ted Byfield's youngest son. And this is my previous book, Alberta Separatism Then and Now. This is kind of basically it's a history of the independence movement from the 1970s through to the time of Stephen Harper. The foreword to this book was written by Vince Byfield. Some of you might remember Vince Byfield. He was one of the founders of the Wild Rose Party. He was Ted Byfield's second oldest son. And what's interesting too, at the time of the 1982 Olds Didsbury by-election, Link was a reporter for Alberta Report magazine, and he was with Gordon Kessler in the campaign headquarters the night that Gordon Kessler won that election, and then he rode with Gordon Kessler to Edmonton in a car after that election, and in his foreword he talks about that, and it's quite an interesting thing. Anyway, I've gone past my time. Thank you very much for having me.